how do you know where to even start? There are so many different levers you have to pull in order to reduce your emissions. No matter what you do as a business, there are lots of different areas you have to focus on. And so in order to actually figure it out, you need information in order to make the right decision, the best decision for your business. It makes it quite challenging for you to figure out where your emissions are coming from if you don't even know exactly what's in your building to begin with, some of these older buildings for sure. And then on top of that, if you're a real estate owner and you own multiple different buildings, then you're thinking, okay, within one single asset, I don't know where everything is. There are 10 different things I need to do to decarbonize this one building, let alone across different asset classes across your entire portfolio. So just a lot of moving pieces. You obviously want to do the lowest hanging fruit first, that will make the most impact first, and then kind of the long tail of like harder things to do you can do over time.
Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Climb by VSC. I'm your host, Jake Kapoor, General Partner at VSC Ventures. I am thrilled today to be joined by Francesca Whitehead, who is a VP at Fifth Wall Capital. Fifth Wall is probably best known as the largest fund in real estate and prop tech investing in this ecosystem. I'm excited to chat with Francesca about the intersection of the built environment and climate. It's a favorite topic on this show. Francesca, thank you so much for joining me on Climb.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is really fun. I know we've gotten to know each other on social and via email, and so it's really fun to actually sit down in person. Why don't we start with a little bit of your background? As I mentioned in my intro, Fifth Wall has a strong focus on decarbonizing the built environment. That kind of matches a passion of yours for impact and climate investing. Take me through that journey. How did Francesca become a climate investor?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say I kind of first bit on the climate side of the story there is that I grew up in kind of mostly in Hong Kong and Vietnam. I think a lot of the worst parts of climate change are just felt front and center from a day to day. And so it was just something that I was brought up with and brought up around. And so I think that still continues to invigorate me when I think about my own investing and what I want to focus on within climate. So it is very value aligned for me. And then on the investing side, when it came to school and every internship I did, it was always within business and finance. So I sort of knew that was the track I was going to go down on. And you can kind of see that with my resume too. It's been in business and finance. And so being able to combine the two is, of course, an incredibly happy place for me. And even with the jobs I had, basically as soon as graduating from college, they've been kind of within that intersection. I joined Goldman Sachs's natural resources banking team. It was learning about finance for the first time, but also thinking about these big industries that I think about still on a day-to-day, and kind of learning about the incumbent side of the house as well. And then my first investing role was at the KKR Global Impact Fund. So again, great place to learn how to invest kind of for the first time and cut your teeth on investing acumen. So great experience there, but again, very much kind of with that impact angle in mind. And I mostly covered things within climate there as well. And then my next role was at G2VP, a Kleiner Perkins spin-out fund, growth tech, climate tech, focused kind of on anything. It's basically anything that any traditional industry, digitizing any traditional industry, I would say. That's sort of the tagline. And some of the deals I worked on whilst I was there was Produce Pay, Pivot Bio, Trove, and Oyster.
Yeah.
So
we had your friend Valerie Shen on the show actually a couple of months ago as well. So got to hear the G2VP story, the Kleiner spin out, and all of that as well.
She was there right from the beginning too.
Yeah, she
exactly.
was. So you guys worked together while you were G2VP.
Yes, we did.
So how did that lead you to Fifth Wall today?
So there are a couple of things that I really wanted. So I wanted to go a little bit kind of more multi-stage. That was something I was quite excited about because G2 is very focused on the growth stage, which is great. But I wanted to do something where I could kind of have more flexibility. I also wanted somewhere with a global mandate, which Fifth Wall has. Just given that my own background, kind of having that global mandate is something that it's just kind of rings home again. And half our team actually at Fifth Wall are immigrants. And so really do come in with a global perspective, despite all having lived in the US for a while. And then just like the final one's like, I really do believe in the thesis. Any company, any individual that wants to be net zero needs to figure out how to make their building net zero. And making the built environment net zero is incredibly difficult. And so I think Fifth Wall is really well positioned with their corporate LP partners to actually be able to solve some of this and be sort of at the nucleus of that conversation.
Yeah. So let's talk about that because I think that's not something we've covered in depth on this show. And I don't know if a lot of our listeners fully appreciate the scope and the size of the decarbonization opportunity inside of the built environment. Obviously, we know, the built environment is large, right? The buildings are going up, countries are urbanizing, and urbanizing means skyscrapers, but even within residential neighborhoods and suburbs, there are a lot of things that need to be built and are being built. How do you think about the scope of decarbonization inside of that sector, and why is it a big enough opportunity to warrant a multi-billion dollar fund?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I always think it's that, like I said, making a building net zero, there's so many different facets of that. That includes things prior to the building going up, right? When you think about it, in order to make a building net zero, you got to figure out what materials are going into that and how those materials, the embodied carbon of the materials going into it. Who are the tenants? How are they using the building? That also impacts like whether the building will be net zero or not. And maybe you're buying offsets as an alternative, but all of that kind of still encompassing with the operations of the building too, as well as thinking about how to actually actively decarbonize, like with heat pumps, let's say.
Yeah.
But then on the back end too, like what are you doing with the end of life of those materials? Because I think that's part of the conversation when you think about net zero too, and that can be applied to a home as well as to kind of more traditional commercial building, as well as when we think built environment. There's also like infrastructure. Data
Mm.
centers sit within the built environment. There are so many other aspects of the built environment. It's not just commercial real estate, although of course that's a big part of it too.
Big component of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And within that sort of environment, as you think about what you're investing in, right?
Mhm.
Beyond the kind of like sector and theme focus, um, what do you look for in a founder coming from this environment? What are the characteristics of somebody that you like to back at Fifth Wall?
Yeah. I mean, part of it, of course, is the standard business metrics and like, are they well positioned in the broader market? Is it big enough TAM? All of those things that
Sure.
we all look at, of course. When it comes to a founder itself, I do think that it's quite personal actually, because you get to be the deal lead and you're picking the themes, yes, but then within that also the founders and you have to mesh too. There are lots of good founders, there are a lot of good funds. That is part of kind of the game. Is it's a relationship driven business. Like, do you guys fit together? Does it fit within sort of the broader Fifth Wall family and personalities that exist there?
Mm.
Like that is part of the equation, as well as like things that I think are important, particularly in climate tech. Is one, do they have someone that has actually worked in the vertical we're talking about? So let's say it's in mining, for example. Is one of the co-founders, have they actually worked on a mine before? I think that's quite important, just given how specific some of these verticals are.
Hmm.
Another one is that, uh, it's sorry. The second piece there as well is, are they able to raise additional funds in the future? Are they going to play
Okay.
well with growth investors, with public markets? Because anything in the climate sector, it's probably going to need quite a lot of capital, and that's just sort of the reality. That's hardware, it's science based. It's going to need a lot of capital, so you need to be a founder that is able to get people to give you capital and fundraise. And it's not just about the metrics; it's also about their personality and ability to drive that home.
Yeah. So to summarize the 2 points, right? One is kind of founder market fit, as we like to say,
Absolutely.
right? And the second is ability to raise subsequent rounds of capital.
Yeah.
How do you, I want to riff on that a little bit. How do
Yeah.
you evaluate that as you're going through your diligence process? The founder market fit may be a little bit easier, right?
Hmm.
Somebody coming from that background. The potential to raise additional capital a little bit harder.
Hmm.
What are the factors that give you confidence that this person fits the fifth wall, mandate?
Yeah. So I mean, some of it is that when you're at the Series A, there are certain things that the seed investor and probably also a lot of A investors aren't looking for that a Series B investor probably is.
Okay.
And like a lot of our team has come from kind of Series B or private equity background, and so we just sort of know what some of those metrics might be. Are they super KPI driven? Or if they're not, are they surrounded by other people that are and they're open to taking some of that feedback, whatever it may be? There are just different metrics people look for. How open are they to putting those in place? All of those
Mm.
are kind of part of that equation. But there is also an element of, are they the right sort of business person long term? Like, is this someone who's public market ready? Maybe it's a little early to be thinking about that, but you might want to start thinking about coaching them into it if they're not necessarily there
Mm.
yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so from what you're saying, I take it Series A is kind of the sweet spot, but you guys will go up and down, or do you like to kind of stay at Series A? And if so, what check sizes do you typically come in at?
We have a range. So I'd say we do kind of Series A plus.
Okay.
So that's kind of our sweet spot. Right. Checks that are 5 to 35 million. And we have a lot of different pools of capital actually. So we have a European fund, we have our prop tech fund, and we have a climate tech fund. And so depending on the exact business model, there is opportunity to co-invest across funds as well as raise SPVs from our LPs if
Yeah.
it's something
Yeah.
that they would find useful as well.
Got it. Got it. So that makes a lot of sense. And you hinted at some of those LPs being corporates and folks that
Hmm.
come from this sector. I'm assuming that also helps you as you're like de-risking a founder opportunity, right?
Absolutely. We use them, we work with our LPs very closely when we go through a diligence process because for a lot of these markets, they are very crowded. And so getting that customer feedback loop is incredibly important because ultimately that's who they're going to sell it to is a lot of this kind of corporate real estate LPs. And so we have a big range. It's everyone from, Starwood, Hilton, Marriott to people like Lennar as home builders and digital realty kind of on the data center side, for example.
Yeah. I think that's so powerful too, because I've noticed that, I mean, we're a seed fund, right? And so within our LPs, we have individuals that come from,
Right.
worlds that overlap with where we like to invest. But it's so powerful to be able to actually go and do customer discovery with one of your LPs and have
Mhm.
that mandate from the top down to say, hey, if you want to speak to somebody inside of the hospitality business and get their perspective on whether or not this is investable, it's something we hope to do, I think, more of as our fund grows as well. Talking about some of the sectors and categories that you invest in, one of the companies I noticed that you had worked on is nZero
Mhm.
in the carbon accounting world. You know, carbon accounting is interesting space to me. I actually saw that you did a breakout session called Carbon Accounting in the Built World
Yep.
at SOSV, right?
With Adam, actually,
With
with the
that,
CEO. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So define carbon accounting for our listeners. What does it exactly mean to you, and why is it so important in the context of real estate tech, prop tech, and the built environment?
Yeah. Also, it's almost as if I teed you up nicely with this LP
You
conversation of
did,
how
didn't
we
you?
how we picked this company. So I mean, just to kind of define carbon accounting, there are, I would say, different flavors of it, but ultimately it is measuring the amount of emissions for a company. And there are different levels of it. So there's scope 1, 2, 3 for types of emissions that can be included. And different carbon accounting companies will do scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, or
What
just
what
one or
what
the
are those?
other.
Can we talk about those a little bit? Because I know some of our listeners maybe aren't super aware. Um, like, what are the different levels, and how do they interact with the kind of accounting we're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say scope 1 and 2 are that's sort of table stakes. That's what most companies would definitely do. It's
Yeah.
basically measuring the indirect and direct emissions from you operating a business.
Okay.
And then scope 3 is sort of the long tail of emissions that's much harder to measure. It's things like at the end of life, let's say you buy a like Coca-Cola can and end of life you don't recycle it. That's kind of part of their scope 3 emissions for
Mm,
Coca-Cola. So it's that long tail for your suppliers and consumers on that back end.
yeah. And why is scope three becoming more important?
It's the bulk of emissions, and it's lots of different estimates being thrown out there. I think somewhere I saw that Shell estimates it's like over 90% potentially of their
Really?
emissions is in that scope 3. But on average, a lot of companies are coming up with a 70% number is from scope 3.
Wow. And so when I think about it, it's not just materials that I'm using to produce what I'm making. It's not just the, let's say, supply chain that I'm using to get those materials to me, but it's also the emissions of my supplier
Yes.
that actually matter when it comes to scope three. Is that
Yeah.
the right way to think about it?
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
And if you kind of force big companies to care about their scope 3, they'll push it down to their suppliers. And so
Mm,
that's kind of ultimately what I think needs to happen for it to really kind of move the needle and get more and more people kind of onto the platform because it's really hard to find every single mom and pop small supplier to get them onto the platform.
yeah.
That is incredibly difficult. There are companies that are definitely trying to do that, but it's challenging. And, these smaller suppliers might not necessarily have the budget to do it either.
Yeah. So a lot of carbon accounting software out there. I feel like we get pitched a different flavor of it for a different environment every month. What excited you about nZero? What did you kind of see about their approach that really stood out to Fifth Wall?
Yeah, definitely. So also going back when you just mentioned earlier about to answer the rest of your question,
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
was around like why it even matters, I
Yeah,
guess.
why matters?
It's like I wrote this blog post years ago at this point, actually when I was at G2, it was my first blog post there. Was about it's literally titled like what gets measured gets managed. That is, and I think that is so true when you think about climate tech is how do you know where to even start? There are so many different levers you have to pull in order to reduce your emissions. No matter what you do as a business, there are lots of different areas you have to focus on. It's a complicated issue,
Yeah.
lots of intertwining different areas. And so, in order to actually figure it out, you need the information. Just like any other business decision, you need information in order to make the right decision, the best decision for your business, in order to reduce your emissions effectively as well. And also see, I'm not greenwashing. I swear I actually reduced it. Look at the data. Like all of that is quite powerful for any company. And then within the built environment, why it matters even more is that a lot of buildings people don't even necessarily know, like, that's exactly where that pipe is there. It makes it quite challenging for you to figure out where your emissions are coming from if you don't even know exactly what's in your building to begin
Yeah.
with, some of these older buildings for sure.
Hmm.
And then on top of that, if you're a real estate owner and you own multiple different buildings, then you're thinking, okay, within one single asset, I don't know where everything is. There are 10 different things I need to do to decarbonize this one building, let alone across different asset classes across your entire portfolio. So
Yeah.
it's just a lot of moving pieces. And you obviously want to do the lowest hanging fruit first, the easiest that will make the most impact first, and then kind of the long tail of like harder things to do you can do over time.
Yeah. So before we get to nZero, let's talk about the why now, right? VCs love to talk about this why now. Um, Obviously, we know the IRA is out there, the infrastructure bill has passed. There are certain these regulatory tailwinds that are coming, but what is it within carbon accounting that you would say is like the strongest why now for companies starting to care about implementing these carbon accounting solutions the same way that they have financial accounting solutions in their business?
So there's actually even more sub regulations that I actually think are quite powerful too. So,
Okay.
I mean, in New York, local law 97,
Yeah.
it's important for any real estate owner to basically figure out where their emissions are coming from and how they can meet some of these targets that are set out so they don't get taxed. And California also has one that came out recently, the SB 253, I think it's called,
Hmm.
where it's like corporates need to start reporting to scope three, like if they're a certain size.
Yeah.
So it's, again, very powerful for actually
Carrot
moving the
and
needle.
stick, right? So IRA and
Yeah.
infrastructure package carrot, and then local law 97 is the stick.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
it's like you should start thinking about this. Um, and yeah, what was the question again? I
So
forgot.
so what? No, all good, all good. What I wanted to kind of dig into was really that why now. So is it
Okay,
all
why not?
regulatory? Is it all that there is this carrot and stick as we talked about,
For
or are
sure.
there other reasons why, like customers, for example, that get these corporates interested in measuring their carbon impact?
Yeah. I think we've all seen the pressures from consumers coming through here where individuals are making choices with their purchasing power and choosing things that are at least on paper more green. They might not necessarily be, but trying to. And they're sort of indicating to companies that that matters to them. And you can also see Gen Zs and millennials, myself included in this, making career choices based on the emissions of certain companies. And
Mm.
as millennials and Gen Zs become a more important purchasing power block there, it will start making an impact. And so that is driving a lot of companies to act now. And any company that's put out a net zero goal, you can say you're going to go net zero. Again, how do you figure it out? How do you figure out what to do first? How much emissions you have right now? You can estimate, but this is sort of the only way for you to measure that in the first place. So it's sort of step one on everyone's journey.
Yeah. I think the challenge that sometimes these corporates have had is, if I can't see it, it's not happening, right? Kind of this idea of, well, if I don't measure it, then I don't
Don't know.
know how badly I'm doing. And in that case, I won't report. And there's almost like a penalty sometimes that the press has
Yeah.
for companies that are transparent and are reporting that get dinged harder than the companies that aren't even measuring this stuff, right? And so, really, the interesting kind of tailwind over the next decade for companies like this would be where is the pressure coming from,
Yeah.
both regulatory and customer pressure, to actually start caring about this stuff.
Yes. And I think it's sort of both and. And to your point, I agree that it does make it hard when if you do report and yeah, okay, maybe you're not doing great right now and you put out a plan to how to get better,
Yeah,
you might get dinged,
yeah,
definitely, by the media and like by consumers alike. And I think that's actually like I sometimes find it's maybe detrimental because they're at least trying and they're further ahead than the folks that have done nothing, to your point.
yeah.
And I would like to see more companies at least give that first attempt. I think we should ding them maybe in 2 years when they've made no progress, but at least them starting to talk about making progress shouldn't be something that's seen as a negative.
And how we define progress needs to change a little bit too,
Agree.
right? Because I think that some of these companies have started reporting and then immediately said, well, I'm going to go buy offsets.
Right.
And the quality of these offsets, whether or not they're actually making a difference, whether or not they're actually incentivizing these companies to pollute more and emit more as opposed to staying kind of on a linear path that they were. I think it all comes back to your very salient point, which is uh, how do you say what gets measured
Gets
gets
managed.
managed,
Hmm.
right? What gets measured gets managed. And these folks that are not actually measuring this and kind of turning a blind eye to it have to face the cost of doing so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think the airline industry has actually done a pretty good way of creating a framework for that,
Okay.
because like reality is then we're not going electric anytime soon for airlines, and so the only solution is if they tell consumers to stop buying their product, which is
Not gonna
not
happen.
realistic, and also isn't necessarily their fault either.
Yeah.
Like it's like I made that choice to get on that flight. They're just providing me with the service. Um, and so for them, like they do invest in SAF, they do invest in electric. They're trying to do those things, but they do also offset. But in that case, I'm like, well, that makes sense. Like, what else are they meant to do?
Yeah.
And so that's exactly what to your point. It's like there should be a framework for how we think about it. If you are, um, I don't know, if you are a company that hasn't even tried to put solar panels on your roof, we should maybe ding you harder for having bought
Yeah,
offsets.
yeah, and there are certain industries that, to your point, can only do certain things,
Right.
and there are certain industries, like in the built environment and real estate and concrete manufacturing, that actually can do more than just buy offsets. And the scale in which you grade these companies has to be reflective of the opportunity available to them, right? So
Yes.
coming back around to nZero, which is
Yeah.
probably 10 minutes ago when we started talking about it, I'm really curious about the methodology that they applied because there's a lot of these different methodologies out
Hmm.
there. It reminds me a little bit of I started my career in finance as well, and it reminds me of like the ratings agencies.
Yeah.
And whenever you're going out to try to get a piece of debt graded by a ratings agency, ultimately they gave you the grade that you wanted within reason if the paper reflected it, right? How do you make sure that a company like nZero stays kind of true to that mission, while obviously expanding their footprint to more and more customers that care about this management?
Yeah. So with nZero, I mean, we did work very closely with our LPs when it came to looking at the carbon accounting space because it is so crowded and
Yeah.
really trying to understand like what they were looking for and what was helpful to them. So some of the things that we really liked about nZero is that they have kind of 24/7 data collection. They use utility, like usage based, not spend based data and emission factors. And
Mm.
so for them, it's that they're linked into all the utility companies. And so if you are, let's say, in Nevada, you use energy at noon, your emission factor is lower than if you use it at nighttime because there's solar being used. And so your emission factor should change based on the time you use the energy in the day.
Yes.
So that is something that I think is quite important because it actually gives a pretty real emission factor in that case. So that's like one thing we really liked about them. The 24/7 piece being another very easy to kind of get that data. Um, Adam is awesome as well. And they also do kind of scope one, two, three. And then on the final one is that they have an insights platform. They have that automated reporting, which I think is a lot of folks do at this point. But they also have a retrofit recommendation tool. And
Hmm.
so if you have a building, you say, should I do heat pumps first or solar panels first? They have a recommendation of like the order in order for you to hit your net zero plan. And you can also put in budgetary restrictions or requirements you may have to help you scenario plan there.
And what do they need to see from that's very interesting, by the way. What do they need to see from a customer to be able to generate that kind of an insight? Is it a human being behind it, or is there actually like data processing that results in these data driven recommendations?
It's a little bit of both. And so they work quite closely with kind of consulting partners. They don't do that work themselves, but it's a mixture of the kind of those two together. And it's a strong kind of go to market strategy there.
Yeah.
But they do have that, at least on the utility scale side, all of that energy data is pulled in pretty automated way.
That's really interesting. One imagines over time you start to build partnerships with the companies that are actually doing that retrofit work,
Mhm.
and it starts to be a really good kind of lead generation business, as well, right? As this business scales.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's very cool. Look, I think the built environment, especially all the way from materials to construction, to contracting to building management,
Yeah.
unlike airlines, actually has quite a bit of opportunity at every step of that way to decarbonize. And so I like that there is a real focus and kind of incentive, and tool for them to do so. So
Yeah. And they
yeah.
actually link with that. They also have a, like, they literally have posted a blog post about how, if you're building in New York, like what local law 97 means to you and some of the solutions they are suggesting. And of course, at the end of it is go reach out to nZero to
Yeah.
find out more. But it is quite helpful for kind of understanding the framework and some of those kind of high level summary points too.
Yeah, this is making me realize I probably need to have like a legislator from the city of New York come in and talk to us about local law because it
Yeah.
comes up quite often. I mean,
Yes.
we've discussed it with companies that we've seen that are creating better induction ovens for rental buildings, that run on battery as opposed to run on, the existing gas lines.
Is that one of our portfolio companies?
It might be. I don't know, right? It is. It's hitting every aspect of your building. So if you live in New York, look around your apartment. There's probably
Yeah.
7 different things that are going to be affected by local law 97.
Yes.
So stay tuned for a future episode. Basically,
Yeah, exactly, for sure. It's also fascinating, even just when you walk around New York City, you can all see the energy efficiency grades that buildings get.
Really?
Yeah, if you look around now, you'll see signs and it'll be like there'll be a D or something written on the door, and it's just a piece of paper stuck there because
Yeah.
they do have to get graded relatively frequently. And of course, our building stock's pretty old here,
Yeah.
and for a lot of them, there's some cases there isn't stuff you can do that unless you remove the tenants from inside the building. And so, what are you meant to do in that case? Like, do you tell everyone they must leave for 2 months as they put better insulation into the building, or do they do that whilst you're in there, which tenants also don't like?
Yeah. One of the
Yeah.
interesting things I've noticed about the sort of like prop tech real estate investing space is there's a certain type of investor that is attracted to it, and then there's a lot of folks that completely stay away from this world, from built environment generally. What are some misconceptions about investing in this category, or why do you think, given the scope and scale of it, there aren't more funds competing with Fifth Wall? Like, why are your competitors staying at bay?
That's a great question. And to be honest, I'm newer to the built environment too. So it wasn't a core focus of mine when I was at G2 or at KKR. It was certainly an aspect and one of the
Yeah.
things that we touched upon, but it wasn't, a core area. And so I think the misconception is around, there are not that many real estate owners and they kind of control a lot of the different assets. And so moving one kind of also topples a lot of them. I think those are some of the misconceptions.
Mm.
Whereas, there are a lot of small business holders in real estate too that are absolutely trying to kind of move the needle in that regard. I also think there are some areas where people wouldn't necessarily think of them as built environment that would be. So, for example, the induction stove example. I don't know if everyone would put that in built environment.
Yeah.
But it goes into a building, so it depends how you define built environment. But
Yeah.
it absolutely could be included too. Whereas some people probably put that in energy or consumer even.
Yeah. Utilities and appliances and kind of all of
Exactly.
these things fitting into the broader umbrella of how do we make energy usage more effective in the built environment, and then
Yeah.
effectively decarbonize or cut down on emissions. So
Yes.
the bigger the umbrella gets, there's a lot more opportunities within that.
Yes.
Yeah, I hear you. I think the other thing is that, like, the willingness to buy and the willingness to pilot, generally I have found, because I spent some time looking at more like the architecture design, like that
Sure.
space. Um, it's people have been doing it the same way for 30, 35, 40
Yes.
years. And I think that's challenging sometimes as an investor, where you come in with this excitement of like, the customer is ready to purchase.
Yes.
And that's not always the case in the real estate environment, I have found. And so, I mean, it's exciting when you see something like carbon accounting they're excited to purchase, or heat pumps, which I want to talk to you about next. I think that's important for investors to see.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see that more and more as we talked about that carrot and stick. But historically, I think that's also been a big challenge, is that if your sales cycle is 24, 36 months long, like, I don't know, do I really want to back a company in that space? Or if I do, how much money do I have to back them with
Yeah.
to make sure that they, make it to the end of that 36-month cycle?
And I always say that's why I think in climate tech, you can kind of see this across the board. People are a lot more collaborative in climate tech because all the companies need so much more capital. Co-lead checks are very common in climate tech.
Yeah.
They have to be. We know that that's just what the sales cycles look like. Maybe not quite that long, but
Yeah.
they are certainly longer than they would be in SaaS. And so that's just sort of part of the reality. And I guess like I've also spent my entire career focused on hard to abate verticals like food and ag or energy. All of them have kind of slow purchasing decision making, and built environment, food and ag, and energy. Let's just kind of go with those three initially, and even fashion, which is an area I used to cover.
Yeah.
If they make a mistake, or even if they pilot something and it doesn't work out, it's pretty detrimental both to the product. Like, let's go with the concrete example of if they use an architecture tool that actually just kind of makes a mistake. That's a building that is got on shaky grounds now.
Yes. Yeah.
That's
literally.
a huge risk.
Yeah.
And so when they have to, it really has to be that much better for them, and they have to evaluate it with that much more scrutiny in order to get there. Similar idea with ag, right? If you're a farmer, why are you going to try this new product on all of your crop if it has a potential risk of harming it in whatever way that may
Yeah.
be? You have to be much more risk averse naturally.
Yeah, I'll give you another example. In the concrete industry, we made an investment in that space where, what we have found is these plants and these plant manufacturers and the quality control guys within these plants have been doing things manually.
Yeah.
And the moment you come to them and say, actually, we've analyzed 7 million data sets of concrete performance and can tell you that by reducing your proportion of this to that, you're speeding up the amount of time it needs to get to a certain level of, PSI thickness or whatever. Fine. The data might show it. If the guy hasn't tested it himself for 28 days,
Exactly.
there is no way that he's putting it into production.
Yeah.
Which means every time that you are piloting something with them, that's already a 28-day cycle before
Yes.
he even makes a yes or no. And it's never exactly 28 days, right? The guy goes on vacation or the union problems or whatever. It continues to be one of these things where I'm more and more, as I spend time in the space, realizing you can't really shortcut that sales cycle. When you're building in the world of atoms and not bits,
Yeah.
like there is just natural time that
Yes.
has to pass. And people that have to be incentivized to move a little faster than they typically do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating, I mean, all of these verticals are interesting and kind of have a similar dynamic, is that sort of when you get one of the big ones, a lot of others will the dominoes do start falling a bit more.
Yeah.
But when you're in that ramp stage, to your point, going to like each mom and pop shop one by one, there is no way of shortcutting that.
Yeah. As an investor, how do you think about the sort of capital efficiency of businesses in this space? Because that's another knock, I think, that a lot of investors have when they look at climate opportunities within the built environment, right? I think it's probably why we see a lot of like climate software and climate AI things getting funded, because it's like, oh, well, they're capital efficient businesses because they look like SaaS. When you talk about things that either interface with hardware, have sensors, have actual hardware themselves, or are in robotics and they're primarily hardware based, what do you look for in terms of capital efficiency, and how does it affect your underwriting decisions as an investor?
Yes. So we actually just did an internal analysis about this, but some of the things we found kind of from analyzing hardware versus software businesses is that when you actually look at the ones that go public, the amount of capital that was consumed, pretty similar, actually.
Really?
It's just that it's used for different things. One is more for CAC and the other is building out manufacturing. So obviously for very, very different things, or other types of CapEx, of course. So it's used for different things and maybe it's staged differently. Like a hardware business, it's CapEx intensive pretty early.
Yeah.
And so that happens earlier on before maybe there's proof of concept. Whereas on the SaaS business, that CAC is ramping probably later on in their cycle.
Yeah.
So it does still, it's like a little bit lower on the SaaS, but it's not so significant as you would think from hearing some of these conversations.
Yeah.
But it does happen like at that earlier stage.
Yeah. What I'd love to see is actually the mortality rates at every stage as well.
Yes.
Because there's certainly, that's a different conversation.
That's a different
because
conversation.
There are a lot of these, hardware focused businesses that raise money early on and never get to that inflection point.
Absolutely.
And I think we've found as a fund that invests in both hardware and software, and I think you guys do as well.
We do, yes.
Is making sure that we're seeing enough customer proof points with the product today, so that it's not like, okay, we're going to sink 15 million into building this manufacturing before we even know that there's a customer behind it. But that's certainly a fascinating fact, by the way, that you just shared, that once you actually see them at their full exit potential, they don't look that different. I think as investors, we probably want to think about how much dilution we're taking on the way up.
I mean, also it didn't account for the fail rates on either side.
Yeah.
Like that part is not included in that comparison. It's the ones that succeed.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's the point, is that the ones that succeed even on the hardware side is on the scale relatively more capital efficient within the scope of hardware.
Yeah, and for our listeners, I mean, the reason that is because you get to unlock debt financing and other opportunities as you go, further down the stack, which SaaS businesses don't get that same same opportunity. So one of the businesses you're hoping is going to succeed and excited about succeeding is in the heat pump space. Voltaire, right? Is how it's said. Tell me the story. How did you meet this company? What excited you about them? Why heat pumps, Francesca?
Yeah. So I didn't mention this earlier, but it's like I moved to London for 6 months. Got back, a couple months ago, just before New York Climate Week. So I spent 6 months in London because we wanted to really build out our European climate tech investing focus.
Yeah.
Like I said, a lot of the team are immigrants, actually from Europe, but none of us have actually worked as adults in Europe. And so that's obviously a huge opportunity. So someone should go cover that.
Yeah.
And we do have a prop tech team already in Europe. And so it was just kind of adding some additional climate tech into our focus areas in Europe. So it was the first deal that we kind of worked on when I moved out there. I'd actually tracked Walter for a while. Prior to joining Fifth Wall, I'd already kind of come across them. And so it was just a continued process. And this round that came together was mostly US investors that came into
Oh,
this round,
okay.
actually. So we co-led it. We co-invested alongside Octon and Wesley Group in this round. I think those were the others that came in. So
Yeah.
it was US
Yeah.
investors that came in. And so one of the reasons why it was the first like deep dive I sort of focused on when I went to Europe is yes, we talk about the IRA for incentivizing heat pumps here, but there it's like a much more visceral. It's the Ukraine war causing the energy crisis,
Yeah.
and like everyone's energy prices going through the roof, and them trying to figure out how in earth they can manage that as an individual. And heating and cooling is 40% of most homes' emissions. And so if you can figure out your heating and cooling with a heat pump, it does make quite a big dent on your overall costs.
And to put things into context, I mean, the country of Germany was like going into panic mode when the Ukraine war happened because of where they're getting a lot of their energy
Of
from and
course.
in Russia and all this. And I think they've gotten a little lucky because temperatures have been warmer this year than they probably expected. But if they were expecting a winter like they had the previous couple of years,
Yes.
this was going to be a massive, massive challenge. And, just costs of heating their homes
Hmm.
was probably going to drive that that country into a level of economic decline that I don't think anyone expected.
Yes.
This is the scale of this problem is massive in Europe.
Massive.
Yeah.
And Voltaire is based in Eastern Europe. And so it's very cold there in the winters, of course. So they're based in the Czech Republic.
Yep.
Hmm.
Okay.
And so
Got
they
it.
actually offer installations of heat pumps in the Czech Republic, Poland, Germany, and Italy.
So walk me through the sort of customer story a little bit because I am a homeowner in Eastern Europe. Um, how do I engage with Voltaire?
So they have kind of two different go-to-market channels. So one of them is they go direct to consumers, and so you can probably find them online. You've seen ads for it, and you kind of click through their website directly.
Yeah.
I'd say that also the average European consumer feels like pretty comfortable about filling a lot of this out digitally online, whereas it's still pretty door to door in the US on the
Yeah.
sales process. It's digital first, like across Europe. And so theirs is a digital first customer journey. And so you as a consumer probably go through that route. And then once you're kind of in their system, they'll like pre-qualify you, screen you, make sure it makes sense for you to have a heat pump in the first place,
Hmm.
and then probably put you on a sales call, take you through that entire process. All of this is still online, remote, via phone call. And then again, eventually you'll have someone kind of do an assessment of your house, figure out like where the heat pump should go and all of that fun stuff. And then eventually you'll have an installer come to your house and they'll install it, and they can help you get financing as well as kind of country level incentives through their app. So the entire
Yeah.
thing's done digitally.
And this is all vertical. Like every step of this process is owned by them. This is not an installer they've contracted or anything like that.
So they do.
Oh, they do. Okay.
They work with installers, and so
Yeah.
they don't manufacture heat pumps, and they don't have installers kind of on their network. So it's a two-sided like digital platform. So that's the customer journey side.
Yep.
On the installer side, right now, US and Europe, there is a labor shortage when it comes to installers across the board.
Yes.
Heat pump installers are different from from solar installers. Solar installers, it's an electrician and someone on the roof.
Yes.
Whereas heat pumps, it's much more technical than that. And also you'll have to go into someone's home and deal with gas lines and things like that. So it is more technical. So they provide training and certification for people to, level up on and become a heat pump installer. That's kind of one piece of it. They also manage the entire sales process. So if you're an installer, you probably like installing.
Yeah.
That's why you picked this career path, and you probably like having the flexibility of being a mom and pop shop. And so again, you get to continue doing that, and they just give you sales pipeline. You show up at the warehouse to pick up the products you're meant to, open your app on your phone, and it'll tell you where to go.
Yeah.
And it's just becomes a very seamless, easy process. And that's one of the reasons we loved it, because on both of those sides, had customer calls and installer calls. Everyone loved them.
Yeah.
It was incredible listening to the installers describe like how much easier Walter had made their lives.
I really like that you outlined why this is different from solar installation because I think we've seen pretty successful examples here in the U.S. of these kind of two-sided platforms for solar installation.
Yeah,
There's still a shortage in that space,
totally.
but less so. And I think the amount of training required probably a little bit lower than something like heat pumps and working with gas lines,
Yes.
and the amount of risk is higher. And so I
Mhm.
think it makes a ton of sense to me why there needs to be somewhat of a brand associated with this space, right? I think it's still starting to be built in solar. There's probably 3 or 4 names that I'm sure you guys have seen that
Yes.
we've seen. Um, I don't know if I've seen a category leading brand built in heat pumps. Kind of what gives you the confidence that it could be Voltaire?
The management team is incredible.
Yeah.
They're a great management team. They are incredibly data-driven people, and all of them have, ex-operating experience at elsewhere as well. It's a great team.
Yeah.
Cannot speak highly enough of them. And they have cracked entering different countries as well at this point. And so that's also one thing we were looking for. And that's the beauty of being a little bit later stage. I get to make that choice, right? Of waiting till they figure that piece out. But that's something we were looking for. And again, when you kind of look across Europe at the heat pump players, to your point, there isn't anyone that's like necessarily hit scale. And so they're sort of furthest along when it comes to the number of installs and their experience on the heat pump side of the house. And
Yeah.
they're a heat pump first brand. Like they will offer some solar if that's something that you're looking for, but their marketing efforts and everything is focused on heat pumps. And that's what they are offering to their installers as well as like, we'll train you in heat pumps, which is more specialized. And that's kind of how they are able to retain their talent as well.
Yeah, I think there's going to be massive opportunities here in the US for something like that.
Yep.
Even just to help homeowners understand the like tax benefits they can have
Exactly.
to do so. It's so difficult. Like I was talking to my dad about this. I'm like, there are like 9 or 10 things you can do at our family home where you would actually bring down your overall tax burden every year. And just first of all, the mental load to understand how to do it, how to file for it, who to actually have come and do this, who's qualified to do this work. There's like 5 or 6 jobs to be done in this space that are between me, the consumer, with all good intentions to green my home,
Yep.
and my ability to actually get the incentives at the end of that rainbow. And so even just managing that process, I think, is a massive opportunity for somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, at least in Europe, a lot of them are doing that on the back end for the consumers. They have to,
Yeah.
because it is so important. And the price point, particularly for heat pumps, is quite high.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of that's how you incentivize people to come on board. Because to your point, even if you want to be the green homeowner, if it costs you $20,000 to put in a heat pump, like that's not a choice everyone can make.
Yeah, yeah. So you talked about this idea of climate tech being very collaborative. Community building seems to be an important part of that for you. So talk to me about that community building aspect of climate tech, and as more and more VCs enter the climate world, I'm seeing more and more fund ones that were not climate focused and fund twos that are. Um, what are the most exciting aspects of that sort of community of investors, and then ideally community of founders to you?
Yes. I think in general, it is people that self-select into climate. Even now, even though it's growing, it is still not as big as tech investing, right? And so it is still a certain selection pool of people who choose to go be an impact investor. And so it's just a different type of person. And I love the community that it brings together. And personally, this is going way back, but I did like A-level sciences back in the day. And so I also just like talking about science and just being nerdy about a lot of these things. Like I enjoy that. It's something that gets me excited every day. And again, like I said at the beginning, I'm personally very value aligned. And there are a lot of the space, particularly when I first joined it, where that was the majority of the people investing in climate tech, impact investing, was value alignment people. But say now it's shifting, and it's become exciting in a different way because it's people that just see it makes good business sense. And so they're coming in for that reason altogether, and kind of becoming climate tech investors because of that reason. And it's just shifting the narrative, but also making it more mainstream.
Yeah.
So there's like definitely pros to that side. Just the community is changing, but that is sort of a big pro too. And it's in mainstream media and things like that as well now.
Totally. I would underline that piece about it making good business sense. I mean, one of the fundamentals for us as seed stage investors is I don't want to invest in things that exist because of a green premium.
Yeah, neither.
Because those things don't last, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's fine that like the IRA tailwind is carrying you and tax incentive tailwinds are carrying you, or customer willingness to pay is strong. But if we take all of that away and you don't have a sustainable kind of growing business, then that's maybe not a business that should exist.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of founders that maybe greenwash their business when they're pitching us, or even well-intentioned feel like, hey, my customer willingness to pay is strong. When we sit there and we do that math with them, it doesn't always hold up to scrutiny. So I would tell founders, like, think about what your business looks like when that green premium, when that regulatory tailwind isn't there for you,
Right.
and is that business still strong?
Right. And it's okay if you're a new product and so you're coming down that cost curve, because that makes sense.
Yeah,
Like,
sure.
That lots of other businesses have done that, but that definitely needs to be an awareness and a pathway coming down.
Yeah, that line of sight and
Yeah.
explaining why the cost of goods or, whatever, like scale is going to get us to cost parity. And I would say, we've had Tom Chi from At One Ventures on the show, and Tom says, "Oh, it's not about cost parity. It has to be 2x better
Right.
because people are happy to keep using what they're using today. If it's cost parity, the friction to switch sometimes is so strong. But if it's, half the cost or it's twice the speed or something like that,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's kind of what we look for. Again, a little bit earlier than you, to understand that, like, hey, this is going to be an investment that we want to ride with for 8, 9, 10 years as an investor.
Yes. No, I completely agree with that. The number of companies that I've listened to their pitch and they pitch the business and it's just around like, oh, I improved the process essentially,
Mm,
digitizing the process, whatever way, shape or form that might be. It just so happens to also be climate. And once you say, oh, we're a climate investor, like, oh, okay, here's actually the like appendix of all those slides that I want to show you. But because they don't want to pigeonhole themselves to just getting money from climate investors, and they shouldn't. They
yeah,
have so many other strengths as well, and it doesn't necessarily matter.
yeah.
And so that's kind of the wave you're starting to see, I feel like.
Are there any categories as you're seeing these, probably hundreds of pitches a month? Like, are there any categories that you feel are overhyped or overinvested today when it comes to either the built environment or climate broadly?
I think some of the challenges in climate broadly is there are a lot of generalist investors that want to tap into climate, have it as one of the smaller areas that they spend some time in. Typically, if they do that, they're only looking at asset light. It's only SaaS, AI, fintechy type things, marketplaces. So sometimes those businesses do get bid up. Just the valuations sort of go kind of a little crazy because there's so much demand from the investor
Yeah,
side for those.
yeah, yeah,
Not
yeah.
necessarily saying anything bad about the businesses themselves. It's just
No, but
that's
there's
the
capital
market.
availability there, right? I think
Yes.
the whiplash founders sometimes see is it's been sort of 6 quarters, quarter over quarter decline in Series A funding. But then you look at the number of Series A funds that were raised the last couple of years. I mean, what are they doing? Are they sitting on their money? They're sitting on their hands. They're, off in the south of France for most of the summer. No, it's. I think that they are probably standing on the sidelines because some of these deals are getting bid up by other folks in the ecosystem. And so I empathize with the founders when they say, "How can there be so much dry powder out there, but none of it's hitting me?"
Yeah.
I think you've underlined why it's been so difficult. If you're trying to stay disciplined as a Series A investor, it can become difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I like to close with you, Francesca, where we close with a lot of our guests. You probably know this question's coming. There is a lot of doom and gloom around
Hmm.
lack of climate action, around the pace at which the built environment is decarbonizing. In kind of your day to day, what is something that keeps you hopeful about the broader fight against climate change?
I already kind of touched upon this earlier. I do think it is millennials and Gen Z sort of becoming a more important job seeking as well as purchasing power within just the broader economy because they are demanding a lot of these things from companies. And so companies sort of need to figure out how to attract them as talent as well as retain them as talent, but also get them to buy their goods and products and goods and services. There we go. I got there
Yeah.
eventually.
Yeah. So I guess to underline that, basically it's that you actually have the power as a consumer, as a job seeker, as a customer of these companies. You have more power than you think.
I think so. And I think it's fascinating, again, having just been back from Europe, they seem to already think that a lot more clearly. And the consumers really do that. And it's a little bit here in the US saying, oh, I'm just one person, I can't move the needle. It's still very much a sentiment here. And so it's fascinating kind of seeing that difference. It's actually quite clear. And you can see it on when you walk around, like even London, which I wouldn't even necessarily say is one of the more far along within the green space within Europe.
Yeah. That's a good place to leave it. I
Yeah.
I feel optimistic already about the winds changing here, and I will say I'm one of those people that often says I feel like we've had 20 years of press from the oil and gas industry telling us, well, it's your fault if you use single-use plastics. Like, well, is it my fault or is it your fault for polluting the Gulf of Mexico? It's empowering to hear that actually there are ways that our consumer choices or our choices in the sort of the professional realm can move these companies to make better decisions,
Yeah.
choosing buildings to live in, choosing places to work. You do have more choice than you think.
Right.
You know?
Like it sometimes is giving up convenience for making those choices, like the single use plastic.
Yeah.
It's very convenient. And so if you're bringing your own mug everywhere you go, it can be annoying, but it's probably that's the right thing if that's what you're kind of leaning towards is focusing on that green side of the house.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to leave it today. Francesca, thank you so much for joining me on Climb. I'm excited to follow your progress with Fifth Wall, going from your experience in climate to now bringing all of that to the built world. And hopefully we'll find some opportunities to look at together. But I want to thank you for joining me on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Climb by VSC. Thank you so much for watching and listening. My thanks to my guest, Francesca Whitehead, for joining me on this episode. Did you know that you can watch as well as listen to episodes of Climb every week? Head on over to our YouTube page where you can watch this episode in its entirety, as well as really fun clips from the show on our socials every single week. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star review on Spotify and iTunes. And if you love this episode, we'd love to hear your recommendations of other guests that we should have on the show. Please keep those coming. Well, that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Climb by VSC. We'll see you next week.